when feminine testing starts to cross that line into a trauma response, usually it's an attempt to control. It's an attempt to control the situation, because it's like there's an unconscious fear of, if my partner doesn't show up in XYZ way, either for himself or for me, then I'm unsafe. I'm not safe.
Yes.
Everything's going to crumble.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Deeper Podcast with Sophie Josephina. And today I am joined by Micheal, and we're going to go talk all about feminine testing. And this is a topic I've been exploring by myself for quite some time now. And the way it was spoken about online by a lot of our colleagues, who I of course deeply respect, but there was something in the nuance I was missing. And I realized that, and it's often the case for me when I think about feminine topics, I couldn't fully get my words onto paper. I couldn't fully materialize my thoughts. And so I was like, there's something about the feminine testing conversation that we're not speaking about. And I was sending this prayer out, and like, I would love to interview somebody on feminine testing. And then Micheal, who I'd connected with before, wrote this like incredible few stories on feminine testing. And all I thought was, hallelujah, there's somebody there that's actually talking about this piece of it all. So I'm so excited he's here today. Micheal is a teacher of trauma-informed embodiment, and his mission is, and this is gorgeous, to assist in the ushering of a body-based, relationally grounded, heart-centered spirituality that does not bypass our humanity. Love that sentence. Yummy. So, welcome, Micheal. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, that was a mouthful, but that's the mission.
Gorgeous.
And I'm really honored to be here. And I was just dancing in the background because I'm so freaking excited for this.
I love this. So Micheal, for people who don't know you, the terrible question of who are you and maybe what are you building in this life?
Yeah. So who am I? What am I building in this life? Definitely a multi-dimensional question. Sometimes I ask myself that question, who am I? But if I were to give it a brief answer, in the context of the work that I do, I'm a coach and a mentor. I'm a guide. I am a brother. I'm a friend. I'm a confidant. I primarily work with men at this point. I actually also work with women. So it depends on the season. But a lot of the work I do, if I could really sum it up, it always comes back to trauma. Always. It always comes back to the body. Because for so many years of my life, I was trying to solve somatic problems with my mind. Mm-hmm. Because I'm so intellectual. And it's just been a passion of mine to help people. And that's what I'm building on the external. There's definitely an esoteric side to what I'm building, and that will be released in the near future, but we'll pause on that. Yeah.
I love that. And you're so right. And I think that's a great, like that there's so much trauma and body-based things underlying it all. I think is such a great segue to what we're talking about today, because I want to get in with you on the feminine testing, which I think very often can have some layers of trauma in there that we have not fully acknowledged in the space. So I'm really curious, where should we start? What do you think is feminine testing?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'm going to give you my definition of feminine testing. I'm going to set some context to place, because feminine testing comes from a teaching, comes from a system. So I think it's really important to have context here, because it really sets the backdrop for this whole conversation. To me, to keep it super simple, because I can be quite a wordsmith. Feminine testing is, I'm going to use genders here just for the sake of brevity and simplicity, is when a woman in a hetero relationship tests her man, or a better word, I think, is invites her man into an opportunity to see himself, to view a part of himself that he might be missing, to view perhaps an incongruency. And the key, Sophie, true feminine testing is always, in all ways, done from an energetic of love, even if it's crunchy, even if there's resentment, even if there's anger, because as you know, the body can hold both. The mind can't, but the body can hold both. And as long as there's that energetic of, I love this, I love you, I see you, and this is an invitation and opportunity, that's feminine testing. And where this comes from, we have to keep in mind, feminine testing comes from polarity teachings, right? And the modern day polarity teachings come from Tantra, the mainstream of it, the main thread at least. Of course, there's other aspects, but the main thread of polarity comes from Tantra. And I think what a lot of people forget is that Tantra was an ancient mystery school tradition. You had to be initiated into that shit. You can just pop in the front door and be like, yo, let's like test some bitches. We're up in here. Can I curse? I'm sorry, I curse.
Yeah, you can totally curse. I love cursing.
Cool. It's like, yeah, you can't just pop in the front door and be like, yo, we're going to get lit on the polarity. It's not how it works. Not how it works. And there's a reason for that. You wouldn't walk into a math class and just hop into calculus. You got to learn geometry. You got to learn arithmetic. And there's a reason. Because these teachings are dangerous in the wrong hands. Yes. And that might sound like ominous, but I have lived that from direct experience, that real harm comes from trying to use these teachings when you're not prepared for it. You need a guide. You need a mirror. You need someone who's farther along than you. Not that they're better than, but more experienced, to help assist you in integrating these teachings into your life. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, you're so right. I was reflecting on this for myself. I was like, what do I feel is feminine testing? And I think there's a very simple version where I will test my partner Tamara in saying like, okay, what do you think we should do? Right? And that feels like a playful, and that feels like an invitation. Yeah, that feels like an invitation to polarity to play. So maybe testing is almost not the right word, but it's like an invitation to play. Like, okay, what do you think? And that's, I want to see if he steps into a masculine energy. It's okay if he doesn't, but if he consistently doesn't, then he isn't the type of person that would nourish me, right? So I can see it in that. But I was asking him yesterday as I was kind of feeling into our talk today. I was like, so do I ever test you? And Tamara was like, oh, baby, you need to sit down for this. Do you want to go here? And he said, like, yeah, you have, like, I've reflected crunchy parts of him back at him. And sometimes that really served. And sometimes that was actually quite ugly and really really not nice to receive. And he said, I don't really know where the boundary is between these two, and I can see how at times you have brought me to a deeper core of myself that I really needed to go to, and at times it was really not okay to receive. And I think this is the case in a lot of relationships. And when we're talking about like feminine oracle, feminine truth and all of that, I very much believe in that. And even I, with all the work that I've done, I can't tell you that I've completely fine-tuned the part of me that will test my partner out of love and the part of me that will test my partner out of trauma, which is a very different energetic. And so I think that's really important to say. Like I know I will also share in here, most of my relationships have ended because my partner said, I can't handle this anymore. You're testing me so much. I can't take it anymore. And it's not a conscious thing that I do, at least. It's not that I think like, oh, I'm going to catch him on a shit. I'm going to point out all the pieces where he's not in integrity. But it is what my personality does. It's like all the places where I feel that a man isn't in ownership of himself, I will press those buttons. And I think, in all honesty, and we're going really deep right away, but in all honesty, that's a trauma response of my own. I am super sensitive to everybody's red buttons because I needed to be. And so I'm sharing a lot of things here, but super curious what's coming up for you.
Thank you so much. And I'm right here with you. I think there's so much there, so many threads to pull. But I really just want to highlight that last part, like, because you needed to be. And
Yeah.
like, that's what I always bring it back to. These are all protective layers. These are all
Yeah.
defense mechanisms. And shame is like never going to solve or shift any of this, just as a caveat, just for like the listeners. I think that's really important to highlight. Um, but what came up for me listening was there's definitely a fine line, right, between exactly what you were saying, testing, and also having standards. And like, you're
Mm-hmm.
someone who's very embodied and like you have depth as a woman. So it's gonna make sense that um, you're gonna perhaps go through a series to find the man who could meet you there. You know, that's just the nature of the game. But at the same time, I'll speak in my own experience. For
Mm-hmm.
me, I have what I find in my past experience, when feminine testing starts to cross that line into a trauma response, usually it's an attempt to control. It's an
Yeah. Yeah.
attempt to control the situation, because it's like there's an unconscious fear of, if my partner doesn't show up in XYZ way, either for himself or for me, then I'm unsafe. I'm not safe.
Yes.
Everything's going to crumble. And this is where like the childhood trauma comes in. I think for a lot of women, again, I'm not a woman, but speaking from my experience of this in relationship, of receiving toxic feminine testing, I think a lot of it comes from um, the father, obviously the father wound, because that's the protector. He's supposed to be the one to
Yeah.
protect us, and so it would make sense that we naturally seek that in our partner. But the question is, like, where do we discern that line? And this is where, like, we're dealing with matters of the heart. We're dealing with like the human emotions and relations. Like, there is no line. There is no clear cut, like, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. Otherwise, it'd be in like a David Ida book and you could read it. It's
Yeah.
just not. It's not what
Bummer.
it is. But what I will say, what I'm learning, and I'm learning this in myself. There's a lot of times, Sophie, where I go to share my truth, and I ask myself this question first. So this, I'll fit this into the conversation, but the mind asks, is it possible?
Mm-hmm.
So in this context, is it possible for my man to align this incongruence? Is that possible for him? Is that in his range? Is it possible for my man to show up in this way? That's what the
Mm-hmm.
mind asks. The heart asks, is this actually necessary right now, in this moment? Is
Mm-hmm.
this necessary? That's a totally different question,
Mm-hmm.
because now we're getting into the nuance where your test might be valid, but in this specific moment, it might not be necessary to directly bring that to your partner right now. You
Right.
know what I'm saying? And so maybe, and through that exploration, what I have found, and it's why I do the work I do, the
Mm-hmm.
answer is not in the mind, it's in the
Mm-hmm.
body. So
Mm-hmm.
I always advise people when I'm working either with a man or woman or anyone or myself, if I have any sense of confusion, that's a sign, pause. I need to go to practice with my body. I need to drop into my body, and then usually through that, you work with the charge, and you'll probably have, in my experience, a clearer answer of the path to take, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful distinction. If I can put my own words to that, to me, it feels like when a boundary or a testing or whatever comes from trauma, there's a sense of urgency to it, and there's a sense of black and whiteness to it, and often a fight response. Like, I
Yes.
want to defend myself or I want to protect something. So that's a very different energy than when it comes from maybe this deeper truth or whatever to call that. But then it feels like more calm, then it feels more fluid, then it feels just oh, you don't want to go into this today, that's totally cool, whenever you're ready or whenever you are open to it, I would love to have that conversation. It's not as charged. For
Yes.
instance, like, without going into too much detail, but Tamara and I had a phase like this about a year ago where he was switching careers, and he seemed to not want to face a part of that. And he wasn't facing that for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And it drove me nuts. And the whole time I was like, but he's my man. And I want to respect him in his leadership. He needs to figure out his own way in the world. And then about 4 or 5 months in, I just couldn't take it anymore. So I definitely felt a bit of that urgency. But it was, I had to, whenever I wanted to bring that to him, I had to do exactly this. I had to go back into my body of like, okay, what is it bringing up in me? It's bringing up in me that I don't feel as safe, or I don't feel as provided for, or whatever. That's my pain that's coming up. That he doesn't necessarily have to take all the responsibility for. What felt like my feminine oracle or my feminine testing was saying, hey, my love, like, I see you, and I so deeply believe in you, and I see that you're in a pattern for about like a few months now, which is totally okay, but I think it's time to face it, And again, even with all of that, it was a very charged conversation, but I think what both him and I kept doing was kept coming back into our own bodies.
Yeah.
And just processing some of the things that it brought up in us, the wounds that it brings up in ourselves, instead of, what I think happens a little bit in this kind of wounded feminine testing, a vomiting of, I'm a holder of truth, you need to deal with it.
Right. And what
right?
is that? That's entitlement. That's the definition of entitlement.
Princess behavior.
Because what we're doing then is, thank you. That was a perfect articulation to what I was referring to. Love the language that I used. That sense of urgency and the black and white. Yes, those are red fucking flags. And not a sense of shame, but just to look at and to be aware of. Shoot, I just lost my train of thought for a second. There's like so much here that there's so many different ways we could go, but we're talking about the sense of entitlement, right? And so what's actually happening in that moment if we're not, and this could go both ways, but we're talking about feminine testing and that piece, right? So if I'm a woman and I have that charge come up, and I immediately, with that sense of urgency and with that sense of black or whiteness, either or orientation, put that onto my partner, I'm expecting them to process my pain for me, and to make sure daddy takes care of me. That's the posture you're putting your partner in. And so that's really unfair and really damaging and really harmful on so many levels, but especially for polarity and attraction. And so the key here is, this is sovereignty. That's all we're talking about: sovereignty, self-responsibility, and being a sovereign being, and saying, okay, I need to work through this, with support. You can have support. Like, there's so many women's containers out there to help women with this, including the work you do. Like, there's a plethora. You could pick them, pick and choose whichever one you want. But how to work with that and then re-enter into that space, because then we're moving from entitlement and this like almost hierarchical or opposing dynamic, like oppositional dynamic, to, again, that sense of openness and safety. And this is another piece I'd love to bring in. I think there's this narrative that the man is always supposed to bring the sense of safety. And I think that's fucking bullshit. I think that's super dangerous. And it's just setting up the context for this kind of wounded behavior to come from the feminine pole. I'm not saying it always happens, but we're setting a stage for it with that.
Yeah, I completely agree. So a lot of what I do, my work is honestly calling out women, the feminine, on all the very creative ways that entitlement slips in, that resentment slips in, because I think all of this beautiful polarity work, we can use it as such. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think the way we talk about feminine testing, the way we talk about oracle, can very easily be misconstrued as this princess entitlement, like you just need to hold me when I challenge you. And that's the thing that I think sometimes I'm with polarity. It sounds really beautiful in the abstract way, and then you're like, yes, of course I get it, until you forget that these are two human beings. I think often what women or the feminine forget is that the man is a human being that is sitting in front of you, that has their own shit, that has their own limitations, that has their own abilities, that has their own needs. And yes, it's so beautiful to talk about masculine and feminine, but for instance, when I am bringing my testing or my pushing back on something, there is still a human being in front of me with feelings, with heart. And he is not, because he's the holder of the masculine energy, just responsible for holding me, holding us, bringing the safety, grounding us. I call that outsourcing, when I think all of that's just being put on one person. That's me outsourcing all the masculine energy to my lover, saying, you got to do it all. When actually, beautiful. I need to hold that within myself and then come to him, because then he's free to step into a role. Otherwise, he's manipulated into a role.
Right. And I think that's like, part of the role, I like that word, for the masculine pole is like redirecting the feminine, that's another discernment, like redirecting the woman back to that power in you, because that's really like the essence of what we're trying to do here. This is the great work. It's the alchemical marriage. It's the union within us.
Yes.
That's what we're moving. We're literally evolving. We're not stagnant. This species is not stagnant. We're evolving into a more unified and energetically unified being. And there was a lot there in terms, and I mean, I could give so many practical examples, but like from my own experience, and maybe we'll get into that. But what I will say is what you're pointing to can easily turn into just like you're dating a fucking label. Like I'm gonna put this label of conscious man. Like, what is that? I have no idea what that is. Please tell me. I have no idea what a conscious man or a conscious woman is. Those are concepts. And I'm saying this because in my past relationship, I clung to that concept. Was used as a weapon against me. It was used as a weapon against me. If you don't do XYZ, you're not a conscious man. It's like, according to who? According to who? I'm me. I'm where I am.
Human being.
And can you meet me here? Can you meet me here? And let's walk together. You know what I'm saying? Because otherwise we're dating an image. And I think a lot of people fall into that. It's very like cliche, like date someone's potential, But in this context, it's very, very fitting for what we're talking about.
I'm just going to ask you on, how have you personally experienced some of this? Because what I love doing in this podcast is having this conversation between masculine and feminine, so that we also understand what it's like on the other side of this, not just on, what we get to do as the feminine. No, what is this like as a masculine being? So I'm really curious if you want to share something.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like this is the first. This is something I've had extreme, like capital T, traumatic experiences from what we're talking about. Not just being triggered, not just, being activated, but quite literally being, it ended up being physically assaulted. And I feel like this is the first, and it really comes, the reason I say that is because it's directly related to feminine testing and the shadow side to it. And like, that's what I'm talking about. This is not just like, we're not even talking about emotional unsafety. It can turn into like a real danger, an actual threat, not even a perceived threat. It can, not, of course that's rare. But yes, so in my own experience, I stepped out of a relationship about 6 or 7 months ago now, But throughout the whole time, I was being what I would now term toxically tested. But I didn't see it. I didn't see it. And that's the thing here, why this is why I'm sharing it. I'm sharing it because I know there are other people out there. Like, I'm in this work. And not even in just polarity work, specifically in relational dysfunction. I'm very trained in that. And it still happened. So if it happens for me, I know that there's people out there who need to hear this.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad we kind of set the context, leading up to this. But for me, my former partner, her name was Jessica. She, without giving you the entire story, and I'll caveat this with saying I am not perfect either. Of course, we're humans, and but what I'll say is that when it came to feminine testing, it was almost as if the goalpost was always moved. The bar was always raised, and I could never quite get there, no matter what I did, no matter what. And you have to understand, for a man, like the feeling of not showing up for your woman, like you're not, that is the worst fucking feeling in the world. Yeah. It's like worse than death. Why? Because it triggers the deepest masculine wound, period, for every single man, which is toxic shame. Yeah. I'm wrong. I'm like invalid. Like me as like a person is like there's something wrong. And that immediately gets triggered for most men. Yeah. When we don't feel like we're not showing up for our women. And so this is a really, really, really painful experience for men to be on this side of what I'll call like the shadow frequency of feminine testing. And as I take a breath and a pause to take a cut deeper here.
Let me just take a moment for everybody listening. Like, this is why I do these interviews, because I want people to feel and see this, that especially when you have a masculine core, to constantly hear you're not doing enough, or you're not doing it right, you're not showing up for your woman. And I will own up to using those kind of words as well when I'm angry, right? And to, especially a few years ago, this was my style of fighting. The way I would get to him was by giving him the feeling he wasn't showing up for me, which there was some truth to it. And it was also a defense mechanism. And so we don't often realize, I think, what that's like to receive. What that's like to receive, and to feel like you are consistently not enough. And no matter what you're doing, you're not showing up for her. You're apparently not a good man. That cuts so deep for a masculine core. And so anybody listening to this, and I really appreciate Michael's vulnerability here, but this goes deep. This goes really deep. So I'm grateful for you sharing that.
Yeah. So if you're listening, I invite you to take some breath here. Thank you for sharing that, Sophie. And so I'm kind of debating how deep to go and what to share, especially in time's sake. But what I will say is that in my specific experience with feminine testing, this is why trauma work is so important. Because what will happen, you will most likely, you will get into a relationship with a partner that perfectly triggers your deepest trauma wounds. Perfectly.
Oh, yes.
That's how it works. The key is there safety? If there's safety, beautiful, healing can happen. If there's not safety, if we're not aware of all the things we've been talking about, then that's a trauma bond and it's dangerous. And so I was in a trauma bond, and the thing that her deepest trauma, without revealing any of her story, because it's not mine to share, has to do with sexuality, just generally speaking. And most people do, right? It's very common. It's very, very common. Like, we all have wounds around sexuality. She happened to have some deep triggers, deep triggers around sexuality, as most women do. Is my man gonna cheat on me?
Yeah.
Does he want another woman? Like, that's what I'm talking about here. Those are the wounds.
I think
a
lot of people will recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are very, very strong. And for me, I went into the relationship and I was clear about this. Before we even started dating, I was like, hey, just so you know, porn use is still a part of my life.
Yeah.
I'm not giving myself a pass, but I know that it's a really deep coping mechanism that I use to cover up a sexual trauma that I experienced when I was younger. And I told her that from the beginning, because I'm aware of that. I've worked with this in therapy. I know what it is. And so when it comes to these things, you even just quitting cold turkey, like, it doesn't actually solve the underlying charge. So I was just letting her know, like, hey, this is, something I'm working through. And basically, anytime I brought that up, because I'm open, I am transparent. Like, if anyone who knows me is like, what I'm like. Not that I share everything, but if there's a rift, I'm going to speak to it in a loving way. Because I want to be transparent and have that communication so that we could come back together. I can't hold that shit, So anytime I used porn, I would tell her, because I don't want to feel like I'm hiding something. I don't want to feel like I need to hide this part of myself. Like, he needs to have a seat at the table. You know what I'm saying? So every time, not sometimes, but every single time I brought it up, it was an immediate knee-jerk reaction of, you're not a conscious man. What is wrong with you? And like verbatim. And I could immediately tell the like level of charge that it brought up in her. That's why I'm saying, like, we need to be able to be with that charge. If you can't be with that charge, that's not your partner. That's you. Yeah. That's your work. You know what I'm saying? That is your work. And so in this instance, I started to, and then I would try and force myself, which was an act of violence towards me, to try and force myself through that coping mechanism. Right. And so eventually it's just, I wasn't really using it a lot. And we're talking like once, twice a month here. We're not talking about like an everyday thing. Like, we're talking about a pretty infrequent experience. And just that I just wanted to be seen. And so basically, push came to shove, to use that, no pun intended, but to use that expression. And I was working with a coach. Your listeners will probably know him, Lauren Kren. Freaking love him. Of course. He's amazing man. We did some really great work together. And just want to shout him out. He's dope. But we were doing work together. And basically, we got to the point where it's like, bro, you can't be in this relationship if you can't bring this part of you. Because that part deserves to be seen. It deserves to heal. It cannot heal. The shadow can't heal in the shadow. It's like, we can't solve the problem from the same level of consciousness that it's at. It has to be seen. And so I was like, okay, like, I'm clear. Like, I need to have this conversation. And what I will say is that that was the conversation that led to me being physically assaulted by my partner. And we're talking like a full on not just like a slapping your partner or pushing them or something. It was really intense. It took me 4 months to really even begin to process that in my nervous system. I couldn't go in public for a few weeks. I couldn't be around people just because I was so, I was in this state of hypervigilance. And I'm just sharing that to show of like, this has real consequences. This is not a game. This is not a joke. And these teachings aren't something to toy with. They're not. I love polarity teachings. I have no qualm with them. The qualm I do have is people like it's like we're giving like a nuclear weapon to a baby. Like there has to be training. Maybe that's not the best metaphor, but it's like there has to be a real education around this, because that was the missing piece for my relationship. These teachings were being used as weapons. That's what they were being used as.
Yes.
And I'm really passionate about this because in the fucking Instagram world, it's like, you don't know what people are doing behind the screen,
Yeah.
You don't.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who talk big game, but it's like, do you really know if they're embodying that? Are they really qualified to be speaking on that? And so that's a whole nother conversation I have.
I agree.
But like in the Instagram world, people kind of just throw out these teachings of like, this is the feminine oracle and this is the conscious man. And we get these like fucking caricatures. And then we try to put them onto a real human being, which cannot be fit into this very limited form. We're multidimensional beings. There's a part of you that doesn't even have a gender.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So, as you can tell, I'm extremely passionate about this. And it's just why why I felt so called to have this conversation is like, if you are in a relationship, if you can't bring all of yourself, leave. I'm radical about this. If you can't bring all of yourself and you've tried to fucking leave, because that's not for you. And there's so much more, I could share on like all of the kind of dynamics that played out in terms of the feminine testing. But I feel like we did touch on like a really like a good amount of them. And I think people will have some powerful mirrors to like look at themselves. And I think the key here is to, what is my part in this? Like, this is not all about the man. This is not all about your man not being in integrity. This is not all about your man watching porn, if that's what it is. Especially if they're being open about it, especially if they're like, they're working. It's like, it's not something that's stagnant. We have to understand like sexuality and any sort of sexual wounding, any sort of sexual trauma, any sort of sexual protective layer. This is the most sensitive area of the human psyche and the human body, period. For men and women, especially women, the feminine has been fucking raped and pillaged for thousands of years. So I know the women listening will understand this, and men too. Men too. So it takes time. You can't expect your partner to be at the fucking finish line before you give them a chance to even start the race. And that's the dynamic that was happening. She was expecting me to just be able to let go of all the porn, like be the multi-orgasmic man, and like that, you know what I'm saying? And we can also bring some lightness into this. Like I've really processed most of this, and it's been a huge blessing. It really has, as paradoxical as that sounds. I am super grateful to my former partner, because she has initiated me into such a deeper embodiment and sense and clarity around my purpose and why I'm here and the work that I'm here to do. And it's been an honor to be able to share that, to share a piece of that with you today.
First of all, I'm really sorry what happened with you. And I think this is a topic that is not enough talked about in any way. It feels like it's in the collective right now. There's some things happening in the public arena where there are stories of men being in abusive relationships. So I'm really grateful for you bringing this, and I'm just really sorry that this is what you've gone through. And I really agree with you. I try to teach polarity in a way of saying, like, this can never be weaponized. These are not tools for more resentment. The goal of polarity is to open. So if you use the sentence of I want a conscious man to close more, then you've missed the mark of polarity. You've completely missed what it's trying to do. It's also a yoga. It's practice. You go to a yoga class. me and my partner both do lots of things with polarity. We are not constantly playing polarity. There are very specific moments where we use those dynamics, we use those energies to deepen our connection. But again, to deepen our connection, not to fight. And that's the difference. It's literally going to a yoga school. That's what you're doing with polarity. It's the art of union. And it's not a weapon. And the last thing I'll say to this is that this is where my partner is a really great mirror. He will not receive any of my shit if my heart is not in there. He'll literally say, girl, I can't feel you. I can't do anything with this.
Yo, that's
Tell
amazing.
me how it makes you feel, for instance, that he isn't always present. Tell me how that makes you feel before you try to give me the feedback or the testing or the pushback. Like, I want to hear what it brings up in you in a way that you are connected to your heart. Not in a guilt trip vomit, like, look how you made me feel shit. But
Yeah,
hey,
because
babe,
even
by
that's
the way,
nuanced.
actually, that made me feel really unsafe, and that brings up some shit in my world. And so I think that's a really key element of, is your heart there? If your heart isn't there, it's a weapon.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe the simplest thing that we can get out of this beautiful conversation that we're having. If the heart isn't there, whatever shit you're doing, whatever polarity stuff you're doing, you are weaponizing polarity versus using it as a tool to greater intimacy.
Yeah, well said. And then at that point, it doesn't even matter if you're right.
No, exactly.
It doesn't even matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Because the fruit is rotten. The fruit from the tree is rotten if the energetic's not coming from love. Period. That's what these teachings are. They're teachings for how to experience deeper love. Right? And it can be very easy to forget that. And I love what you were saying in terms of, like, even sharing this is one of the biggest things I work with people on, is like language and communication in charged conversation with emotions. Because even sharing your emotion with your partner, this, and you touched on this beautifully, like, this made me feel XYZ. There's a way to do that from the heart, but that's still, you're not filtering, and you're authentic, and you're sharing your authentic vulnerability. And then there's a way to do that where you said the words vomit, but the image I get is you're pinning your partner against the wall. You're pinning them against the wall, and you're like talking at them instead of staying in your experience and letting them into you. You're penetrating into them. Does that make sense?
Oh my God.
And that's
completely.
that's like the image I get with that. And that will not result in, because that's not, it's not safe enough. There's actually no space. There's no space to move. You know what I'm saying? So that's a great piece. That's a great piece to bring in for sure. Yeah.
So, like, I'm trying to compare this to when I brought something to my partner of where I could feel that he was sticking his head in his sand, and I wanted to give him all the space to figure that out himself. And at a certain point, it just started to affect me in our relationship. And so I brought it to him, the story that I brought earlier, which was a beautifully needed moment. It was me calling him back into his power, actually, because I said, if I love you, I respect you, I think you're an incredible human being, and I want you to step into that again. I'm ready for that. You're ready for that. I think what I find the tricky thing with feminine testing, and I'm curious what I would love to hear is what you would love to receive as a masculine core, is, let's say, for instance, you want your man to join a men's group, right? I get this question all the time. I want him to, like, do tantra or do a men's group, and he's just not going. When does that become a feminine oracle thing? And when do we leave that to the masculine to find his way? Because if I know one thing is that if I go to my partner and say, I want you to join a men's group, he's going to resist me because I'm not his mom, I'm his partner. I'm not his coach, I'm his partner. And so there is a very subtle art, I think, of trying to, like, what I can do is share my enjoyment with my personal development and with my kind of support systems and all the things I'm going through. And often that inspires my man to be like, oh yeah, I also want to deepen. I want to meet you where you are. I'm also going to deepen. So what's the maybe being super like anal about this right now, but what's the difference, I think, between giving a man his space
Mm-hmm.
for him to find his own way in life and trusting him in that,
Mm-hmm.
and doing this feminine testing thing of like, okay, but I would love to challenge you because I love you.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. This is this question's gold. And I have women reach out to me all the time and ask
Yeah.
this exact question. And we touched on the first piece, which is sharing your authentic emotional vulnerability in a healthy way. That's a great doorway. If you haven't done that, boom, that's your starting point. Because otherwise, yes, you posture yourself as mommy automatically, pretty much. And
Yeah.
So there's a few ways to approach this, but the question was giving your man space, but then also being in what we could say insistent, perhaps.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things that come up for me, and one is tact. If you're coming with any sort of tact or plan, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. Like, I'm gonna do this thing to show him to get him to do that. That's no, it's not gonna work. I think you started to touch it though. For me personally, I can only speak for myself, right? But for me personally, when I see my woman growing, I have to grow. There's something inside of me that's like, I need to show the fuck up, and it's never. She doesn't have to say anything to me. Yeah. And so embody what you want. I mean, it's really that simple, right? Like, be the model in the feminine form of what you want. Cause that's, and it's the same fucking thing. Like, if I'm trying to, like, when I was healing from like really deep family dysfunction, right? It's the same thing. It's really that simple. That's my answer. Because when I was healing from family dysfunction, this is a really great example, because it's the same type of dynamic, in the sense that if I were to just go to my mom or my dad and be like, well, what, that this thing you're doing is wrong and it's unhealthy and dysfunctional, and that, like, they'd be like, dude, what the fuck are you doing? Like, get the fuck out. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't work. But what did work was I embodied so deeply boundaries. I embodied so deeply mirroring. Oh, I hear you say this. Yeah. Wow. I embodied so deeply what I wanted to receive. I embodied that, and it rubbed off on them. It affected them. And that's one piece. And there, of course, there has to be a willingness. There has to be a willingness on the man's end, and that's the thing. I think it's the hard can be, and of course, this is not black and white. I want to caveat this is not black and white, but like, we can't give someone that willingness. It doesn't matter if we're talking about men or women. This is in all areas of life. They have to choose that, and I think embodying, because what you're doing, if you're a woman and you're embodying, like, you're doing the women's circles, you're like doing womb work, you're out there like fucking ripping up grass and like letting your emotions flow, but like in a container, and you're doing it, it's like, he's gonna see that. And if he doesn't see, and if that's like, that will inspire him. And if it doesn't, that willingness, like, I'm not, like, it may take some time for that like spark to get stoked, and that's okay. But I think a lot of women, I want to be careful with what I say here, but I think a lot of women end up just trying to save people and just like staying in relationships like, dude, this man's just not ready. That's just not where he is, and like, we can't make someone be farther along the journey. And that's the thing where I think a lot of people get stuck, because it's like, wow, if I actually face that, that means I leave the relationship, right?
Yes.
And that can be a scary thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be my take on it for sure.
If I could share a personal story here, is that I, of course, joined John Wineland's training, and I very much wanted to do that separate from Timber because I wanted to have my own process and my own adventures there. And without me even asking, it inspired him to go work really deeply with a teacher. But that would never have been a teacher that I would have picked because it's this very classical, spiritual. It's not my cup of tea at all. So if he had done what I wanted him to do, he would have, I don't know, been with whatever, also with John, whatever. That could have been what I wanted him to do. But actually, he found his own way. And what's happening in our relationship now is he's coming with so much more consciousness, so much more depth, so much more personal development, so much more finding himself. And so it's not the thing I was actually desiring from him is happening anyways, but he's finding his way in it. Rather than me saying like, oh, I need you to do X, Y, Z. He's just feeling like, oh, Sophie's going on this really cool journey. I also want to have a journey like that for myself. And we are meeting each other in that authentic, like really individual thing. And so it's almost when I let go of the shape that I think it needs to have and focus on my own deepening in that thing, it naturally does inspire your masculine because he just wants to meet you where you are. Again, coming back to this really deep longing to be a good man for your woman.
Yes. We're wired for that. And here's the thing, I really want to presence this. We're way more tuned in and intuitive than I think women give us credit for.
Yes.
Your man will fucking feel you. If you can't have an ace up your sleeve. You can't have a fucking trick in the bag. You know what I'm saying? You really have to let go. And that's why we were talking about somatic practice before, because it's going to be scary. You're letting go of control. You're letting go. And so you have to be able to work with that, you know, to let go and be like, what you're saying is, I trust you. That's what you're saying. You're saying, I trust you. I trust you. It's you and your soul. How could I possibly know what's right for you? How could you possibly know what's right for another person? We don't. And so that's so powerful what you shared, because by you just letting go of that and following your next step, we're talking about energy and frequency. It's just they're naturally going to oscillate and anchor in to that level if you give them the space. But it can't be lip service. It can't be lip service. It has to be actually embodied, you know? And I experienced a lot of lip service in my past relationships, and I could feel it. I feel like that's actually not how you're feeling. Yeah. And I would dig, and then it would come up. You know what I'm saying? So this really has to go deep, has to sink down to the roots. Yeah.
And let me, outside of the what happened to you, but I think this is sometimes a really beautiful thing that the masculine can bring, right? He can help deepen a woman. He can help connect her to her feelings. Like, hey, darling, I can't feel you yet. Where's your heart? Give me your heart. I want to feel you. What's happening here? So I do think that in it, again, these are beautiful concepts. And in a certain situation, that is a beautiful dynamic to be in. But this can be weaponized. This can be used as a closure. This can be used. I think what's really important here, if anybody knows like fight or flight and these kind of mechanisms, you know when you're in a fight or flight response.
Yeah.
Right? You know when you're shut down and you want to retaliate. When you are using polarity from that zone, the only thing that can happen is that somebody can meet you in the same activation. They have to defend themselves. Yeah. Right? You'll feel when it's open, when you're coming from a place of love, when you're coming from a place of I care about you, I care about us. This is complicated. I also don't know what all the answers are, but I love you. That's a very different nervous system activation. And to have that awareness in relationship is, I think, such an important skill, because if you can bring that, like, hey, I realize I'm super activated right now, whatever we're going to do is not going to serve us. Right? Whatever conversation we're going to have right now is not going to it's not going to help anybody.
Got the swords out.
Yeah, nothing good is going to come out of this. Doesn't mean that it's wrong, but just nothing actually productive is going to come from that. And to wait to have these conversations when you're actually both able to open. and to soften
Yeah.
and to wait for that to happen. I think that's maybe one of the core aspects of this testing, of wait for there actually to be receptivity in both of your bodies. If it's not there, it's not the time. It's just not the time. What needs to happen is connection back to each other, your bodies to touch each other again, or maybe some time separate so that you can regulate. But otherwise, that's not the time to do these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's just two things briefly that came up for me listening to you. Because these are things, like, you don't have to be in a relationship to practice. Life is a relationship. Even right now in this conversation, there's a reason why, I waited 4 or 5 months to even begin to speak about my experience publicly, because even still, I feel myself oscillating between open heart and attack. Open heart and attack. And I'm sure people can feel that. And there's nothing wrong. There's nothing bad about that. But it's like, we can train ourselves to be aware of that and learn how to work with it. Learn, okay, oh, wow, I see that's happening. That's a sign for me. Let me take some breath. Let me feel my body. Let me feel my heart. Let me feel this person in front of me. Let me look at these beautiful plants behind you. You know what I'm saying? And like open up a bit. And with that, as you get more practice in that, if you're a woman and you're listening to this and you're in a relationship with a man, and let's say, like, it's right and it's deep and it's true, but maybe that was your question: how could I introduce him to maybe some more personal development? I know you're out there, so I got you right here. If you've done everything we mentioned, one thing for me, I could almost like cry. For me personally, it's really deep. And I think a lot of men have this. For me, growing up, a huge way I validated myself, but also gained validation from others, was like not only my intellect, but like my knowledge, my wisdom, right? And every man has a genius, every single one. I'm living with a friend of mine who owns the house there, and he's a genius with cars. He's a mechanic. He's a genius. You throw a bucket at him, he's like, I don't know, but he's a genius with that, right? So what I would invite you to do is find your man's genius and notice it. Water that plant, water that seed. Get him a gift. He likes to read about, I'm going to talk to myself. He likes to read about esoteric consciousness shit, weird shit. Get him a book like that. Like, feed that. Yeah. Because that's like, again, we're going into the balance of, like, we don't want to have, like, tact and try and manipulate our partners. But that's different from what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is acknowledgement and awareness. Being aware of what inspires your partner and support them in that. And that will really start to move energy in this dimension for you. I guarantee it.
I think that's so beautiful. I can feel that, because I think a lot of feminine beings, a lot of us, a lot of myself, it's so easy to sit on the, like, oh, well, these are little places where it should be better. It's easy, it's comfortable, it feels safe, it feels like you're taking care of yourself, and I get that. But to also bring in the energy of praise and of just, my teacher John Wyman calls it, like, gushing over him. Like, oh my gosh, I just think you're amazing at this one thing. And it could be something so tiny, but to just gush, because that's nourishment. That's literally what you're saying. It gets the energy moving. That's how we water the masculine.
Just like a little, so much that can happen with just a little movement. Babe, I think it's so hot when you're, like, doing your studies and research and that. I'm just talking. That's my thing. That's my thing. I'm just talking about myself here. But, like, if I heard that shit, I would be, like, super turned on from that. Yeah. Because then I know, like, every time, like, because as a man, you feel powerful. You feel like you're king. You know, you feel your
Yeah.
king energy, and then you want to take care of your woman. You want to better yourself. You want to grow. It's natural. You know, we naturally, it's part of our nature
Yeah.
as men. And I think a lot of men have just been so cut down and so discouraged. And
Mm.
it would be like such a pattern disrupt to receive the opposite. So look for that in your man. It could be literally anything.
Yeah.
And you start from there.
I
Yeah.
love that. What a beautiful way actually to close this conversation, because this feels like such a, what's it called? This feels like the core of it all, like the, yeah,
We,
it's nice that to
we
almost,
brought it back to love. It
we
feels
brought it back to love. Yeah, to
like.
almost like,
Yeah.
I feel like my thoughts or my structures in my head are like falling into place as we were talking. But feminine testing, I think, is this gorgeous, really cool thing. But the foundation of love and of praise and of mutual respect needs to be there. If that's there, then feminine testing can be really a really interesting dynamic to start playing with and to start exploring. Again, a yoga practice, explore how we can push back to the masculine in a way that opens him, not shuts him down, breaks him down, shames him into being better. How can I start testing my man in a way that opens him, that's an invitation to play with me rather than fucking I suck? That's such a different energetic. And again,
for sure.
practice. One thing that, like, I think we are really making very clear in this whole conversation is it is a practice. It is like going to the yoga studio and practicing the art of relating. That's what this is. You don't have to get it all right, and it isn't all set in stone, and it's just trying things out. What is opening him? What is lighting him up? Yeah.
Yeah. Beautifully said.
Thank you. Holy shit, what a conversation. My God. Wow.
Yes.
Wow. All the flavors.
So-
Michael, if people would like to learn more about you, where can they go?
Yeah, it is Micheal Angelo on Instagram. That's where most of my work is. Anything I do, I'm sharing on Instagram. So that's the place to find me.
I love that. I was referring to you as Michelangelo, and I was like, wait, I don't think that's his actual name.
I'll take it. I definitely resonate with him as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Michael. I so appreciate you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.